Hello, I'm Peter Weller, and today we'll be discussing the quagmire of the Vietnam War. While some saw it to be a necessary evil, many more believed it to be the slaughter of millions of innocent civilians. Easily the most debated foreign policy issue in America, the conflict had far-reaching impacts on both the United States and Vietnam, which are still visible on both countries today. Without further ado, So throughout the documentary, there will be a troop count on the right-hand side and a timeline on the bottom of the screen, just to better contextualize what's going on. During World War II, Japan invaded Vietnam, leading Ho Chi Minh to form the Viet Minh, or League of Independence for Vietnam, who fought both French and Japanese colonization. This organization would later become the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in 1945, with Ho Chi Minh as president, in the northern city of Hanoi. This would become a problem, as Emperor Bao Dai was already supposed to have control of Vietnam from its capital in Saigon. Tensions escalated between the two sides and peaked at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, resulting in a debilitating loss for French forces. This led to Geneva Treaty negotiations that split the country at the 17th parallel, with a caveat that there would be a unification election in 1956. But in 1955, the strong anti-communist Ngo Dinh Diem pushed Bao aside to become president of the government of the Republic of Vietnam. Elsewhere in the world, Cold War tensions were mounting. The U.S. and Eisenhower were pledging more support to Diem in South Vietnam to help stop the spread of communism. The United States gave him training and equipment from American military and police, which he used to crack down on Viet Minh sympathizers who he called the Viet Cong, or Vietnamese communists, many of whom were tortured or executed, which invariably brought about violent resistance. In 1957, the Viet Cong conducted hit-and-run attacks on government officials and buildings, and by 1959, they were engaging in full-fledged firefights with the South Vietnamese military. In December of 1960, opponents of Diem formed the National Liberation Front, made up of both communist and non-communist members. While they claimed to be independent, D.C. thought them to be a puppet of the government in the North. In response, Kennedy sent a team to investigate, and as a result, increased troop commitment from a mere 800 in the 50s to 9,000. These were the first actions taken by a president in subscription with the domino theory, which stated, if Vietnam fell, other Southeastern Asian nations would fall as well. 3 weeks before the assassination of JFK, Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu were both assassinated in a coup of his own generals. The ensuing political unrest persuaded Secretary of State Robert McNamara and LBJ to increase economic and military support. The following August, DRV torpedo boats fired upon the USS Maddox, prompting Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This gave the president very broad and unspecific war-making powers, and what LBJ kindly called Grandma's nightshirt, because it covered everything. Adhering to the domino theory, LBJ was quick to begin bombardment with Operation Rolling Thunder. By June 1965, combat troops amounted to 82,000, while General William Westmoreland wanted more than double that by the end of the year. Despite mounting public pressure, Johnson ordered another 100,000 by the end of July, and again by the end of 1966. The strategy of Westmoreland and Wynne was to win by attrition, by killing as many of the enemy as possible rather than capturing targets. While bombardment initiatives were supposed to accomplish this, they would only embolden the enemy, who would emerge from their caves with a newfound hatred. The coordinated bombing and shelling of these areas made the aptly named free fire zones inhabitable by the natives, who were displaced to refugee camps surrounding Saigon and other major cities. At this point, 15,000 soldiers had died, and yet the government was insisting that the war was being won. American television routinely broadcasted horrific images of war, motivating 35,000 people to protest in front of the Pentagon, condemning the support of a corrupt dictatorship. In 1968, the Hanoi Communist leadership grew impatient and launched the 70,000-troop Tet Offensive on the Lunar New Year. Coalition forces responded quickly, and the Communists could not hold a target for more than a day or two. These attacks caught the American public off guard, which was further dismayed by Westmoreland's request for 200,000 more troops. Approval ratings got the attention of Johnson, who halted bombing in the North and vowed to seek peace for the remainder of his term, rather than re-election. In March 1968, Johnson laid out a path to peace in a speech that was well received by the leaders in Hanoi and the political branch of the Viet Cong. Peace talks began in May in Paris, including South Vietnam and the NLF, but soon reached an impasse. During this time, aerial bombardment efforts ramped back up, and atrocities like the My Lai massacre occurred. It seemed that the path to peace had reached a dead end. Johnson's successor, Richard Nixon, appealed to the silent majority of those who supported the war effort. He also began the process of Vietnamization, giving the war back to those whom it concerned. Then, on November 15, 1969, the largest anti-war protest in American history occurred in Washington, D.C. 250,000 Americans gathered peacefully, requesting for American withdrawal from Vietnam. The following year, a joint offensive between South Vietnamese and American forces invaded Cambodia and Laos to hopefully destroy bases along the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail. This sparked a new wave of protests across college campuses due to the violation of international law. These protests most notably resulted in the deaths of 6 college students at Kent State and Jackson State. After a failed offensive, the North Vietnamese in Hanoi were willing to compromise and drafted a treaty with Secretary of State Kissinger, only to be rejected by the leaders in Saigon. After this missed opportunity, Nixon had to bring both sides back to the negotiation table. While he threatened General Thieu with removal of all support, he ordered the highly controversial Christmas bombing of Haiphong. Though his methods were uncouth, to say the least, they resulted in a treaty that ended open violence in January of 1973. Pockets of violence would occur for another 15 years, but then, on April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into the presidential palace in Saigon, effectively ending the Civil War. And then, in 1976, the country would be united as a Socialist Republic of Vietnam. While America's intentions for getting involved in Vietnam were undoubtedly benevolent, its actions have forever marred the region. The bombing campaign in Cambodia destabilized the country, allowing the dictator Pol Pot to seize power. His actions would result in the deaths of 1.5 million people in a country of 8 million. In the wake of the Vietnam War, 2 million Vietnamese died, and 3 million were injured, while another 12 million were displaced as refugees. According to a survey by the VA, 1 in 6 veterans who served in Vietnam suffered from PTSD. In addition, they suffered significantly higher from depression, drug addiction, alcoholism, and suicide. But what's worse is that these men didn't have the hero's welcome of World War II, like the ticker tape parades, but instead were often greeted with animosity. For those who supported the war, it seems like these men had lost it. And for those who protested against it, it seemed like these were the men who'd slaughtered innocent civilians. But in all truth, these were just kids who were in Vietnam because some people in DC thought they should. Although the men named here at Alabama Veterans Memorial may have died in vain, it's important that we remember their legacy and their lives so that we do not commit such events ever again. Until next time.